biblical scholarship or make sense out of it, that you read one passage and another comes to mind. I mean, we read the Bible a lot of times like you'd read a 20th century novel from beginning to end, looking for a consistent storyline all the time, when sometimes we should learn to read the Bible as the Bible is written, that the passages and the books are in dialogue with each other. I bet you never thought of that. That Mark is talking to Matthew, and Matthew's talking to Luke, and Luke's talking to John, and when you let that play, sometimes they talk to you. Which was my experience this week as I read the first miracle, the first act of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark. Now remember, we know that the Gospel writers, just like us, if you all left today and were asked to talk about the worship service, some of you are still probably singing The Little Mermaid, and that's all you've got in your head, and other of you will have caught on to something else. You have different perspectives that you relate. The Gospel writers did the same thing. And as Mark tells his fast-paced tale of Jesus, he begins with the call of Jesus, the baptism by John the Baptist. He immediately moves into the temptation, which is very, very abbreviated compared to Matthew. And then he has the calling of the disciples. I will make you fishers of men. And then immediately, and that's what Mark says, immediately Jesus is confronted by this man who is possessed, and he performs his first miracle. He's confronted by this man. He performs an exorcism. And it's very interesting as you listen to the conversation, because it's not merely a conversation between Jesus and this man, but it's a conversation between Jesus and the multiple spirits that this man feels in him that are talking to one another, a tormented being in that regard. Now, exorcisms are not unique to Mark, but exorcisms are at the heart of Mark. Mark, if you want to know about exorcisms, Mark's loaded with them. Because obviously it was important for Mark, for people to know, people who read his gospel, to see Jesus as one who had power over the principalities and powers of this world. That's who Mark's Jesus is. The Jesus who immediately encounters evil and seeks to eradicate it. Mark's Jesus is a Jesus of action. Now this is where it gets interesting, because if you have that picture of Mark, then jump way over to the Gospel of John, written many years later, and how John introduces Jesus. You know, John has this whole Greek thing at the beginning, this logos thing, and then as he moves forward, he tells of Jesus being in Cana, which is near Nazareth, at a wedding feast. And instead of confronting a man who's possessed by demons and exorcising him, which is the first miracle in Mark, John has him doing what? Going to a party. Going to a party, going to a wedding feast. Now, John says this is his first miracle. He turns water into wine. Now, granted, Jesus doesn't want to do it. He's a little reluctant. But who does he give in to? His mom. Yeah, you ever met a Jewish mother? You got to give in to them. You have got to give in to them. You see, John relates to us up front, at the beginning, a very different first miracle. We got a conversation going on here. Mark and John. Now some of you may be thinking, okay, what's the big deal? What's going on? What's the point? Just two stories. I think not. I think not, because the point is we have two very distinct stories, two very distinct tales, initiations of the ministry of Jesus and the memory of the evangelists. And when we read those, if you read them separately, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, which of those Jesus do we choose? Mark gives us this Jesus of immediate action in confronting evil that destroys, that causes dysfunction and disunity. And John gives us up front this far more pleasant Jesus who allows the party to go on. What I tell you is, I like John's Jesus. I like the party. But I need Mark's Jesus. I like John's Jesus. I like the water into wine. But the Jesus I really need is the one who seeks to confront, name, and eradicate evil. And our society likes the John Jesus too, that image, because that's where we've been. And it's easy to push aside or ignore the other Jesus. But Mark won't let us do that. This summer, my wife and I, when I was on sabbatical, my wife and I had the pleasure, and I do say pleasure, of being able to worship in other churches. You know, when you preach a number of times during the course of the year and you lead worship, you never get to be in worship. You know, you're kind of thinking about the next thing, moving along and so forth. So it's always grand to go to another church and actually worship, and we did this. And it just happened that in one particular Sunday, one particular church, the text that was being preached on was the wedding ceremony in Cana, the water into wine theme. And I thought, okay, this is a great text. I was really looking forward to it. But I was praying that the preacher didn't go where I feared he might go, which is where he did. Because essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not, this is there, so I'm not trying to eliminate it, but essentially what he said was that Jesus was the life of the party and that Jesus wants us to always have a good time. In fact, to the applause, I'm sure, of a number of people there, he says, yeah, you should golf more. Enjoy life. Because that's what God wants. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think God wants us to know joy in living more than anything. But the joy in living that God talks about and wishes is not the joy of self-indulgence or the joy of self-absorption, which is what I heard. In fact, if I had had a teenager there, I probably would have left, because teenagers get preached that gospel by the world all the time already. Self-indulgence and self-absorption and just having a good time for a good time's sake has been the party that's been going on for far too long. The world's gotten that message, and the world's gotten into a big mess. And I'm not trying to be real critical, but all you got to do is look at the national, international debt. We've had a great party. But the party's over. And now we don't know how to respond or act. We don't know how to go on. And so what happens when you get in those moments of chaos? That's when evil strikes, because that's when we start blaming and naming and pointing fingers and getting angry and hostile towards us, towards one another. We want to keep that party going, when what we really need is an attitude adjustment, a revisioning of our focus that says we got to roll up our sleeves, we got to get down to work, we got to identify with the other Jesus, the Jesus of Mark who says it's time to kick the devil out. Going after that which divides us. Remember, the demonic had multiple personalities that were in conflict. To go after those voices that conflict and complex us in order that we restore within ourselves, both individually and corporately, as communities, as a society, health through wholeness. Remember, salvation means to be brought back into balance, to be made whole. Because where there is oneness and unity, where there is wholeness, there cannot be cracks or fissures that make us weak. Think of your body. You got an illustration of this all the time that you walk around in. When you are healthy, your body is in balance. Everything functions. It works well and it works perfectly. But when things get in our system that cause dysfunction or knock that balance one direction or another, get us off the track we were wired to function in, then we lose that harmony within ourselves. Just tie something around your arm. Tie it around your arm until it starts to hurt, right, or go numb. And then release it. And then what happens? As the blood reflows, you feel a cleansing action. You feel burning as bad stuff that's already begun to accumulate is eradicated. And your body goes back into the balance that it was meant to have. That's how it works. And when it doesn't work, we get sick. We can even get so sick, we die. And you know when you're sick, how do you feel? Not very good. You don't feel good. And when we don't feel good, and of course, this isn't describing me, we get grumpy. We get grumpy. And if it goes on long enough, we get bitter. And if it goes on even longer, we get depressed. And it goes on longer, we begin to get angry. And we can lash out at anybody and everybody, and most especially those people who are closest to us. You see, this imbalance, these fissures that let the bad stuff in, affect us all, either directly or indirectly. You know, we are all, at least I'm assuming that we are all appalled by the senseless killings we often see on the news. Just senseless stuff that just doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. But then it also makes no sense to me when I turn on the television and I see people whom I'd expect a whole lot more from, based on their education and their status and so forth, doing exactly the same thing. Oh, they're not killing people with guns. They just kill one another with words. You know, you can kill somebody's character just as sure as you can kill their bodies. Senselessly kill